Hi, in today's video I'll be utilising these two glass containers that I found and turning them into this forest-esque setup. I really like how it turned out, so stick with me to see how I made it. To get started with this project, I used my Dremel tool with a glass cutter attachment to cut a hole in the bottom of the smaller jar, and I sprayed down the glass to cool the tool and to prevent glass dust from becoming airborne. Now, ideally, I would have used a glass hole cutter, however I didn't have one to hand. Also, it's important to wear some sort of safety gear, so I wore oven gloves. Now that the glass is cut and cleaned up, I can move on to the hardscape. I've got this piece of wood, which I'm planning on having leaning out slightly, but I am going to have to trim it down a little bit. I'm thinking of sitting this piece here on top of it like that and going from there. So, let's get right into it. I broke a bit off the end of the wood, just so the scale would suit the terrarium better. I proceeded to apply silicone to both contact points and I left it to cure overnight. The jar is fairly secure balanced on the wood, so I decided not to silicone it down. The next day I started by adding a drainage layer of leaf to the larger terrarium. Once done, I cut a barrier from geotextile fabric, cutting around the dish at first and then trimming it down further, and then covered up smaller holes around the wood with more fabric. On top of this I added my substrate, which contains cocoa coir, orchid bark, compost, vermiculite, sand, worm castings, sphagnum moss and small amounts of leaf litter. I find it drains really well and is perfect as a terrarium substrate, although I'm running low and will have to make some more soon. Let me know down in the comments if you want to see how I make it. At this point, I wanted to add some more variation to the hardscape. I decided that making it look like a forest floor would really complement the larger wood centerpiece. I added a much finer branch, which partially wraps around the small terrarium, makes it feel like it's been there for some time and the wood has grown around it. I also added some smaller pieces around the base to try and create some more variation and mimic roots. I started off by planting some common ivy, weaving it under and around the terrarium. The larger, broader leaves will really complement the other plants. You can also see that I added a few river rocks to break up the plain soil. The main focal point of this terrarium is a furry feather calathea. I started off by removing most of the soil with tweezers and then cutting a piece off using a knife. As long as you leave adequate roots, the plant should be fine. I proceeded to wash off as much of the soil as I could in lukewarm water. I planted it in the background behind the log. Despite it looking a bit lonely now, it really helps bring the two terrariums together later on. As I'm trying to recreate a forest floor, I knew that lots of moss was necessary, so I turned to my moss boxes. They're looking a bit empty, so I'll have to go out and collect some more moss soon. I decided to cover the entirety of the soil with moss, as it really unifies the scape, but I decided to keep the top log free of moss as I have another plant later on for that. I used a mixture of fern moss, thyme moss and hypnum moss to create variation in the scape. Now it's time to move on to the smaller terrarium. As it's on display much more, I decided to use slate as a drainage layer, as I think the darker colour really makes it seem like it belongs there compared to Leica. I again covered it with geotextile fabric that had been cut to shape. Like before, substrate was added and the remaining furry feather was planted. I covered up the roots again and flattened it down with a spoon. More slate was added in the foreground to tie it all together. I decided to keep it simple as I didn't want the inside of this terrarium to be the focal point, and so I planted it only with moss. More moss was planted on sphagnum moss on the log. Now for the plant that will really tie the whole thing together, oak leaf creeping fig. I finally managed to get some, and I'm not using much here as I'm propagating it to have more in future projects. Some was planted on the log on sphagnum moss, and more was planted around the base of the log. It really helps bring the entire forest vibe together. Now no forest scape is complete without botanicals, and so I added an ivy twig, some sand for texture, and some mini pine cones. I'm not too sure what they're actually called, so please let me know. And of course, lots of leaf litter was added, mainly small oak leaves but also some others. Anyway, that's all for today, so thank you so much for watching and see you guys next time.